unmediated, uncontrolled, unfacilitated, you're just like taking psychedelics and then expecting like, oh, now I'm going to meet God. It's like, well, you'll probably meet, there's a chance you'll meet something if that's what you're looking for, right? But it might not be, and it might even look like an angel or God or something like that as well, but it's not always going to be the case.
Well, and on my biggest trip, I met an entity that warned me about other entities I might meet, so.
Alex Stock, welcome to Maniphesto's YouTube channel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good. So yeah, you are one of our viewers and regular commenters. I've had a couple of times people say like, wow, there's really good comments on Maniphesto's videos a lot of the time. And you're one of the contributors to that, I would say, maybe the biggest contributor to that. So I'd actually like to start off by saying thanks for that. And it's a real pleasure to be able to have a conversation with you, not just through little short comments on YouTube, but face-to-face as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting out content that's commentable.
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to be able to have some of these conversations with guys like Jonathan Peugeot and Alexander Bard and all these interesting exotic people that are doing interesting and exotic stuff. Yeah, and then good to just talk to normal everyday people yourself, like you know, in life as well. I don't know if you consider yourself to be a normal everyday person, but I kind of warned you. I said like I'd like to start by just asking you a little bit about your background, and the topic for the conversation that we've kind of lined up has been something like the relationship between science and Christianity and religion, and especially these kind of top down and bottom up views on reality, and how both of these things actually use, you know, science and religion both use top down and bottom up, and there isn't necessarily the same conflict between them that we sometimes get out. So yeah, but I thought I'd start by asking you, can you just tell us a little bit, like, you know, where were you born? Who were your parents? And how did you first get introduced to these topics of science and religion? Kind of what was the frame for that?
I was born in Arizona, kind of a smaller town. My dad spent most of my kind of early childhood in prison. Developed more of a relationship with him after. My mom was Catholic-ish. She liked the structure of Catholicism, but she kind of, whatever religious idea felt good to her at the time, she'd kind of run with. So I did do some of the, like I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church, even though I don't think about that much, but it was the case. I remember being agnostic and bordering on atheist at a very young age, asking questions about, you know, I talk to God, he doesn't talk back, which the reason I have that in my mind so forefront is because my oldest son he started asking questions like that around 3 or 4. So I saw a bit of myself.
So when you say a very young age, you mean 3 or 4, you already started?
I don't know if I remember that age, but certainly as far back as I remember asking questions like that. And it was something I just kind of assumed and moved forward with, but was always questioning. Mm-hmm. By the time I was a teenager, agnosticism turned into atheism, turned into nihilism, and that's where I spent a good chunk of my teenage and early adult life. Eventually, because of a relationship, I started exploring Christianity and saw that there was some intellectual foundation there, and I had enough of the emotional desire to, I guess, give up the skepticism for a while.
Can you say, just like when you say you went into atheism, then nihilism, was that like a really dark time for you? Like, were you fully into nihilism, or was it just like
very
kind of
much
a bit more of a, yeah?
Yeah, it got very dark, and I still had a conscience, and that annoyed me. Mm-hmm. But I was definitely pushing as many boundaries as I could, and saw all versions of morality as imposed and arbitrary. Mm-hmm. Of course, like I said, there was something in me, conscience, that was always tugging against that, but everything in me intellectually was trying to dismantle morality. Wouldn't necessarily say truth, but certainly value. Mm-hmm. And getting in a relationship is kind of what I guess pushed me into. I was confronted with value, caused some re-exploration. When you say you're confronted with value in your relationship, then suddenly you realize, like, oh wow, there's value here that I like, or what do you mean? Yeah,
something like
and
that.
I think intellectually I just assumed, you know, again, it's arbitrary, but I'm enjoying it. Over time, it became more real, I suppose, had more ontological weight. Mm-hmm. I would say at that point, my intellectual explorations weren't as intellectually honest, but I'm glad for that because it led me down the path that I feel was more honest. When I was a nihilist, I was definitely more angry, and that can also easily, skepticism can prevent you from the truth as much as it can find you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you could take a radical skepticism and deny everything. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
David Hume was great at that. The only reason you think the sun's going to rise is because it's happened before, but that's not a logically valid explanation or reason to anticipate it.
So, but this was kind of like amateur studies that you were into, and you're like reading a whole lot of different stuff, and then you said it was actually the personal relationship. Is this your current wife that you met?
Unfortunately not.
No, okay.
No.
But it was a personal relationship with a woman that
Yes.
kind of was the milestone for you, or the shifting point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then what happened?
She was a Christian, and I began exploring it. For a long time, it was nominal, not very real, just kind of something I participated in for the sake of the relationship. Eventually, I really started reading the Bible and became kind of a, not fundamentalist necessarily in the ideas, but in the intensity. For a while, I was very fundamentalist and Pharisaical. There was the narrow path happened to be shaped like me.
Okay.
And then eventually it broke, and I kind of re-entered the skepticism, started studying science more intensely than I had before. I couldn't let go of Jesus as a person, even though intellectually I feel like I was almost trying to find a reason. But then through some strains of biblical scholarship, which on the one hand helped launch me into that, also helped me recover, realizing that the Bible wasn't exactly the kind of book that I thought it was. For a lot of Protestants, which I was a Protestant, a lot of Protestants, the Bible is something of an idol. It takes the place of God. And it was that way for me, and I came to realize that it wasn't quite what I thought it was.
Can you trumpet a bit more words when you say the Bible wasn't what you thought it was? Like, can you try, back then, how would you have you described your relationship to the Bible, and how has that changed?
Part of it would be in the category of infallibility and inerrancy. I don't think the Bible is quite trying to be that. And it's not that I don't have now a high view of the Bible. I very much do. And anyone who talks to me, especially my unbelieving friends, probably wish I wouldn't talk about it as much. But I think those are later categories that we imposed on it, especially with the specificity. Obviously, the early church fathers have a high view, but it's not the same as kind of the post-Reformational and post-Enlightenment view of it, as more similar to how Muslims view the Quran, especially conservative Muslims. I don't think the Bible was ever meant to be that. And part of it ties
kind
into
of seeing
that,
the Bible as a scientific document, which is like precisely describing historical facts and making truth claims or something like that, right?
And denying the bottom-up aspect of it, acting as if that's like purely arbitrary. The historical things that birthed it are just incidental because God was trying to speak. And I think, to sidetrack, but I think that's also the Protestant view towards Mary. She just was a vessel by which God happened to enter the world, but otherwise isn't that important. That the context that birthed the Bible is viewed in a similar way. All of those things aren't really important. What matters is what God is trying to say. Whereas I think those contingent factors are important in informing it. The way I would say it is, when you fall in love with someone, you often have like rose-colored glasses and view them as perfect, pretty much a divine human walking among us. And over time, you realize there's some cracks in that image, and you can either kind of maintain that vision of perfection, or you can embrace them for who they really are. And I feel like the truly loving thing to do is to embrace who they really are. And I kind of had that with the Bible. And again, once I found orthodoxy, it's not, again, not that orthodoxy doesn't have a high view of the Bible by any means, but it's not quite that, like you said, scientific, rigorous. And over time, I've just been kind of incorporating that period, my biggest existential crisis, of really exploring science and non-Christian philosophy, which includes other religious systems as well, incorporating that with the foundation that I built and am rediscovering in Christianity.
Okay, cool. So yeah, you said you've converted about a year ago or something like that to Orthodoxy. You're working repairing computers. You're a technician of sorts, and you're married today too. Is your wife also Orthodox?
Yes. Yeah, she was skeptical at first when I was talking to her about it, and then first time she went, she was pretty much sold. So
yeah, my wife was also she went first time she went into an Orthodox church. She was like, yep, that's where I want to be. So it took me a little bit longer as well to get over some of the skepticism. Okay. So yeah, thanks, Alex. And then you also asked your priest, I understand, before having this conversation to like if you should engage in that. Maybe you can tell us like what's that's a strange thing maybe for people who aren't Orthodox, that you needed to ask permission for a priest to talk about stuff on YouTube. What was your reasons for wanting to do that?
Well, if you spend any time like asking public intellectual figures within Orthodoxy, like people like Peugeot, or even priests will often say, talk to your priest, because Orthodoxy is very much about a face-to-face relationship. People on the internet don't know you the way that your priest should. They should be engaged in your lives, know where you're at, and tailor kind of, I guess, your path based on the knowledge of you as a person. Whereas virtually, as in through the internet, a lot can be lost and people can present themselves falsely. Whereas hopefully if you have a relationship with your priest and are confessing, and I guess them just watching you, because really every good Orthodox priest is also a legitimate psychologist, psychotherapist, and so on. They can see you better than you often can from the inside. And it's the reason I approached him when I thought that would be appropriate. Also, I know that I'm prone to pride, and I very much want to discuss ideas like this publicly. So he could see aspects of myself that I couldn't. So
good. Well, good.
But yeah, it's a frustrating thing, the Orthodox tendency to say, ask your priest, because people just want like solid answers right then and there. But it's really important that Orthodoxy does that we're meant to weave our lives together with people, and it's harder to do online.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were talking about with the Bible, and that there's like a context specificity to everything. And so, every question you ask, it's like we've tried with this kind of modernist approach to disconnect rules or principles or ideas from their context, but that's not the human experience. And there's always, exceptions that kind of, no matter what rule you create, then human life is so unique in its complexity somehow, right? So I guess that's what's trying to work. Of course, it doesn't always work. There are bad priests out there who, don't care or give bad advice or answer from their own perspective for their own advantage. But there's also something, for me at least, in knowing like, okay, well, I can ask my priest, and then in the way that I understand things, like it's actually his responsibility. And so as long as I'm not acting against what I know to be right or wrong, in a case where I'm really don't know, then asking my priest, I don't need to ask him about everything, but if I'm in doubt, then I can ask him, and I can just do that, and I can do that with confidence and relax into that. So yeah. Okay, good. So can you try and present this idea about top down, bottom up? Like, what do those concepts mean, and how do they get used in different fields?
I do have a quote here by George Ellis, who's a scientist who's trying to, he's a cosmologist, trying to get people to see this. It's a little terminology laden, but in the hierarchy of causation, top-down works by setting constraints for lower-level causations, thus channeling lower-level interactions while respecting their lower-level physics, which paradoxically creates new possibilities. One easy symbolic.
Give us that one more time, Alex. I think we're going to need that one more time. A little bit slower.
Okay. In the hierarchy of causation, top-down works by setting constraints for lower-level causations, thus channeling lower-level interactions while respecting lower-level physics, which paradoxically creates new possibilities. So it maps onto some of the symbolic stuff that the lower levels are full of potential without actuality, and something has to constrain that potential into something actual, which produces more complexity. So a very easy, I guess it's not easy, but one example that got us started is the laws of physics constrain the kind of bubbling potential of matter. The quantum is definitely bottom up. It's chaotic, full of potential, but no actuality. And then the laws of physics constrain all of that potential into something actual. And that happens at various levels, from constraining a quantum field into a particle, constraining particles into an atom, constraining atoms into molecules, and that goes all the way up to organisms. And I would argue beyond that.
Yeah.
But an easy way to think of top down is constraint. And people think of constraint as restraining, but it actually creates potential in the same way that if you, I think it's Vervaeke gives the example of, it's like, let's play a game. Or no, it's Jordan Peterson. Let's play a game. You go first. And you can't do anything to actually make it fun, to make something real out of it. You have to put constraints on it, start putting rules. Without doing that, of course, there's essentially infinite potential, but without doing that, or with doing it, you can actually do something. Let's see, I'll give some examples. A lot of that seems very abstract, but as I start to fill it in with examples, it'll make sense. So annoyingly easy example, why is water boiling? One valid explanation is there's a fire under a metal pot and the metal conducts heat very well. And there's water, the metal transfers the heat from the fire to the water, and the water has reached 100 degrees Celsius, so it starts to boil. That is a valid explanation. An equally valid explanation from another perspective is I was going to make tea. Without me desiring to make tea, the water wouldn't boil. Of course, the bottom-up example of the fire metal conducting heat from the fire and transferring it to the water, that is a valid explanation.
Yeah, and you can even go further and saying like, oh yeah, somebody created like a gas pipe from a gas canister and then like create a little hose, and this hose turned by so many degrees, which allowed gas particles through, and then a flame was applied. So go more and more gradual.
And even that is, we're talking at such a higher level. We're not talking about the vibrations and fluctuations in quantum fields. So yeah, even most of the reductionistic explanations are still like operating at a higher level where you've already assumed some kind of top-down influence.
Yeah.
Another example that's more real. So I don't know, there's the case of Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker that got a pole through his head and underwent a complete personality change. He was a loving husband and father before, whereas after he was just an awful human. Everyone kind of gets that, especially materialists. It's like you damage the brain runs the mind. People don't realize though that it works the other way as well. Your mind affects the structure of your brain. And an extreme but helpful example is if someone were to tie you up and brutally slaughter your family in front of you, your brain hasn't been touched, but that would actually, the perception of that event and the realization of what it means would restructure your brain in measurable ways. There's a lot of research being done on how brains significantly impacted by trauma are wired differently than brains that haven't been. So that would be an example of top down, because the mind is up top. Even if you want to argue the mind is generated by the brain, it's nevertheless the case that once you have a mind, certain things impacting the mind restructure the brain. Yeah. And another simple example along
is there just what is there anyone who's still, I mean, I know that that's like a popular understanding that the mind's generated by the brain, but is there a serious scientific position still, or is it that pretty much all of science has also decided like, well, actually, you know, we can't even find that much of a direct relationship between, you know, how the mind maps onto the brain?
I haven't recently surveyed neuroscientists enough to give you like a consensus. I can say that there are plenty of neuroscientists who think, they might say that it's more complicated than we thought, but they still ultimately think it will boil down to some version of that.
Okay. Okay. I know some neuroscientists who've told me, you know, we have one guy in Maniphesto as well who's like, yeah, these things don't map onto each other. There's actually not that much of a direct connection, but yeah, I guess there are still people who are holding on to this materialist, modernist understanding of it. Yeah.
Another related example is the placebo effect. You give two scenarios where you have two identical pills. On a molecular level, they're identical. In one case, a person that looks like a drug addict, homeless, runs up to you on the street and says, take this pill, it'll solve all your problems. You probably won't take it, but even if you do, you might end up feeling worse, thinking like, why did I take that? I shouldn't have done that. What was in that? So this pill in the hands of that person might make you feel worse if you take it. Whereas a doctor that, you know, has all these degrees and things hands you the same pill and says your symptoms will alleviate. There's a good chance your symptoms will alleviate. The only difference in this case is how you perceive it. So your top-down perception of the context of the pill actually changes its bottom-up effect on you. And it's related to the
demonstrable ways, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And psychedelics also, I know you've talked about psychedelics a lot on the channel. You often think of it as bottom up because you take a substance and it can produce these visions and changes, but like the work with smoking, the one high dose of psilocybin can quit smoking, and something like in the 75–80% of people who are smoking addicts. But the missing piece there is it's the people who had mystical transformation. It's not just a matter of the substance itself doing work. You have to have some sort of visionary experience, which top down has this influence. If you were to somehow take a bunch of psilocybin and either not have a visionary experience or take a sedative to put you to sleep, even though that pharmacologically might not make sense, but if somehow you just slept through it, you wouldn't have that same change. But because it kind of condenses into a higher vision, that vision will emanate down and produce changes in people. A great example that I could probably spend like hours on is just evolution itself is very much a top-down and bottom-up. And if there are those in the audience skeptical of the larger theory, it's not required. Even the most ardent young earth creationists that I know will still generally believe in slight changes over time within a species. That process is bottom up and top down. The mutations, at least from our perspective, are random and seem to bubble up. And then selection is a top down force, and that can be natural selection of an environment. It could be sexual selection, like one member of a species evaluating another. That happens in humans, obviously, but it also happens in spiders and pufferfish. And then obviously artificial selection, where shepherds, agriculturalists will see certain traits pop up in a population and then selectively breed to amplify those traits. But in each of those cases, the process is bottom up and top down. The mutations are bottom up and they kind of emerge unpredictably, but once they're there, something higher up, whether it be the environment or a partner or a breeder, will constrain those possibilities and create something new from it. You could say that a polar bear being white is, yeah, it's top down, bottom up. Bottom up, it's mutations that polar bears had slight changes in their fur color, and then the environment favored those that had the white fur. So the environment is much a creator of the organism as the bottom up mutations.
So Alex, with all of this bottom up, top down, like, why do you think? So yeah, when typically we have a typical, like a religious person talking with an evolutionary atheist or something like that, right? So normally what you see is like you have like the religious person is coming with these like top down things, like, you know, wisdom or truth is through revelation. The evolutionary psychologist will say like, no, it's all just like kind of it comes out of existence or something like that. It's all generated through potentiality. Where are these two people missing each other, and what do you think the causes of that? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I'll start transitioning to the religious side, and my favorite example of this is Genesis 1. So it's a lot of people, most Christians probably read Genesis 1 as a purely top-down, you know, God says and it happens, and it's just his command shaping things. But if you pay close attention to the wording, you know, God says, let the earth bring forth vegetation and living animals, and the earth brought forth vegetation and living animals. So that has both simultaneously right next to each other. The command is top down, the earth bringing it forth is bottom up. If you had a video camera, all you would see is the earth bringing forth. You wouldn't see God's command. And of course, when scientists will insist, no, the earth just brought this forth, there's no God in the picture. They're correct in the sense that if you somehow had a cosmic video camera and could watch the process, you wouldn't see God doing it because it's operating at a different level. But so that would be my.
Yeah, so it doesn't say like the earth or just like vegetation suddenly appeared or something like that.
It specifies the earth bringing forth. So the God's word is an agent, but the earth is also an agent in that context.
Mhm.
And if you are really attentive to that kind of pattern in the Bible, you'll see, well, just in Genesis 1, a lot of scholars have noticed that the structure of it is very similar to ancient Near Eastern temple ceremonies, where a temple is dedicated to a god, and there's kind of final steps, which often was a 6-7 day process. And the last step in the process was to put an image of the god in the temple, like an idol. And the last step of God's creation process in Genesis 1 is to put his image in there. So humans, in a sense, in the same way you go to a temple dedicated to a god and you see a statue of that god, but that's what humans are in the cosmic creation.
Yeah.
But why not just rule it directly? Like, part of it is humans ruling, but why isn't God just ruling? But he kind of delegates that task to humanity to rule on his behalf as his image, in the same way that in a pagan temple an idol functions in place of the god, but humans are functioning in place of God. And again, if all you had is a video camera, you'd see humans shaping the earth, but that doesn't erase the divine command behind it. And same thing with the prophets. Why doesn't God just speak, like shout from the clouds to the people of Israel? Instead, he sends a prophet and is almost trying to get the appropriate response to bubble up from among the people to get them to repent. You see that especially in Jonah. Like, Jonah even doesn't even preach a message of repentance so much. It's just like, you're going to be destroyed. And then kind of bottom up, the people end up repenting. So even with an unfaithful prophet, in a sense, God will still get his result, even if it looks bottom up. Because again, if you had a video camera, all you'd see is Jonah preaching and these people all coming to their senses and changing their ways. You wouldn't see God talking to Jonah with the video camera. And there's countless examples in the prophets of what I'm talking about. Isaiah 10, God says he's going to punish the Israelites for being disobedient, and he's going to do this by sending in a nation to punish them. And then God evaluates the nation, and the nation is like, we just conquered, we're awesome. And then God sends another nation to punish them for their arrogance. So again, with video camera perspective, all you'd see is this nation coming in and conquering the Israelites for their own gain. But God says, does the axe boast over him who swings it? Like, from the top down perspective, that nation attacking was God swinging an axe to chastise his people. From the bottom up video camera perspective, you just see one nation pridefully trying to conquer as much as it can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you have.
So we have this tendency to be overly reliant on when it's our own actions, I guess, seeing ourselves as the ultimate source or kind of the cause of our actions. I suppose
it goes back and forth. A lot of attractive young women in churches will tell you there's a lot of guys that say God told them that they should get married. So that'd be an example of the opposite. Their bottom up desires being attributed to top down commands from God.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's kind of my main point, is that these things interpenetrate so much, and they're not in conflict. Jesus says, I saw Satan fall like lightning. That often gets projected back into the past, but he says that in response to the disciples going out and casting out demons, preaching the kingdom, and they come back and tell him about it. And in that context, he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning. So I would argue that, again, with the video camera, you'd see disciples walking around and things changing. But if you have the eyes of Christ and could see kind of the spiritual perspective, you would see Satan being dethroned as that happens. Mm-hmm. And there's countless examples of those two being presented side by side. Psalm 18, the first half is David describing like God bending the heavens, riding on a cherubim, shooting flaming arrows and destroying his enemies. And the second half of the psalm is David describing in a more earthly video camera perspective how he actually overcame his enemies. Mm-hmm. And the Bible often presents those two not as in conflict, but as a harmony. It's, do you have earthly eyes or heavenly eyes? But it's the same event.
Okay. Alex, there's like so many examples here. I'm like, there's some really, really good insights. I'm like, wow, yeah, that's really true. Oh, wow, that's really true. And then, but I want to dive into one area that's been really relevant for us, actually, for the rest of this talk, I think, in Maniphesto's. We've been talking quite a bit about sexuality and actually sexual morality as well, like as in like principles for how to use one's sexual energy in one's life. So, obviously there's this very kind of, I think Christianity is probably if it's well known for anything, then it's certainly well known for a kind of top-down approach to sexuality. It's like sexuality has to be in marriage, and this is the way it has to be, and everything else is bad, or something like that. Everything else is sin. But one of the things that I've tried to communicate to people, which is quite difficult because of this kind of stereotype, is that actually this is a bottoms-up perspective at the same time of being a tops-down perspective as well. Do you have any insights that you can share on that? That can maybe explain it better than I can.
Well, I'd start off by saying there's definitely truth to that, and especially in Western Christianity, post-Augustine, he was something of a self-proclaimed sex addict, and his conversion to Christianity, he just associated with sexuality with his previous sinful life, and that had again a big influence in Western Christianity, and it often did have kind of an unfair, or at least imbalanced top-down control method. In Eastern Christianity, I mean, you could make the same sorts of arguments, but it feels more organic, and you have Chrysostom certainly saying things that Augustine wouldn't. Like, part of the reason for human sexuality is reproduction, and Chrysostom was saying this around the year 400. He's like, the earth is already pretty well populated, so it also has the aspect of pleasure and maintaining, I guess, the relationship between the couples, preventing adultery, and so on. There's a lot that could be said on this. One justification, I guess, bottom up for more scientifically minded people is if you do a genuine survey of historical hunter-gatherer groups, and by historical I mean those who as best we can tell, most accurately reflect how humanity from the scientific perspective spent most of their perspective. Monogamy is actually way more common than you would think. And ironically, there's almost never any top-down control about it. It's just kind of culturally. The closest thing to a human control group I think there is the Hadza tribe in Africa. And they're an example of this. They're monogamous, but no one's been able to detect any explicit rules about it. It just kind of ends up that way, seemingly by itself. Of course, that doesn't mean that there's not a higher level thing going on, but and then I guess larger arguments of destructive patterns. And that's, again, it comes post-Reformation. People start denying the reality of patterns, and that's top down. Another way of describing that is patterns. Like, you have matter, but the laws of physics are patterns that constrain that. Yeah. And I would argue that patterns are as real as matter. I wouldn't necessarily say more real. I'm not a full Platonist in that regard. But if the patterns are real, such as like power laws, the Pareto distribution that Peterson talks about, it controls how capitalist wealth is distributed, but it also describes the distribution of stars within galaxies. It describes how cities will form themselves, even though at every level people are making individual decisions. These patterns replay themselves. So in regards to sexuality, I guess the larger question is, are there patterns of sexuality that are destructive, that don't bear fruit? And just an example, someone like Camille Paglia, who she herself kind of identifies as trans. So it's not me saying it, it's her, that she studied androgyny because she identified as androgynous and found that it appears all throughout history, but it's always like right before collapse. So if you think that patterns are real, playing with some of those sorts of things are flirting with destruction, because every other time they've been demonstrated, it leads to destruction. And that would be my larger point about sexuality, without getting into the specifics. That could be its own talk, and I'm not exactly an expert.
When I started thinking about it, I was really surprised that just in the own areas that I know about, like, so take, for example, like old stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Like, marriage is all the way through here. People don't maintain perfect monogamy throughout all of these stories a lot of the time. Just like, if you just go to an average church, then, people divorce, and there's, they commit adultery and stuff like that as well. Even like, in the Bible, all the stories you have about marriage contains all this stuff as well, but it's still seen as, seems to function as a pattern of harmonious fellowship between, or connection between a man and a woman, that just seems to have the highest level of functionality. I didn't get what we were speaking about Paglia and kind of collapse of civilization. I'm
Yeah,
not.
she identified as she might still identify as androgynous, and she
I didn't
studied
know. I knew that she
androgyny.
was a lesbian or something like that, but
Maybe she stopped identifying that way after
I
this
don't know.
discovery, but yeah, she just found that, again, the pattern of androgyny popping up as culturally dominant. There might always be like little flares of it here and there, but when it really is kind of front and center in a culture, is an indication of impending destruction.
Do you have other? I always hear the Roman Empire is the example of that, and Nero. Do you have other examples as well of when that's popped
I
up?
don't. It's not something I've studied myself. I yeah. All I
For me,
again
like
for
what it
me,
really goes down to is this idea of identity. Like, what is it that we're identifying ourselves with? And I see, you know, like for most of when I've been able to look at different times, then like a functional way of defining one's identity has been through how you contribute to others around you. You know, so I'm a shoemaker or I'm a builder or a mason or something like that. And and then what I see is like a sign of, you know, a concerning sign is identity based on how you get pleasure, how you get sexual pleasure. It seems like a weird thing to create an identity around that doesn't have any function, and seems to just lead to pain in these people's lives themselves, right? Because it's often an identity based on a victimhood story, actually, or on a kind of like outsider status or something like that, which removes them from being an acceptable part of, you know, the core or the foundational part of society. You know, and it's not like I don't do that myself as well. I can sometimes, like, you know, parts of my identity are based on being the outsider, right? But when it's the very core of who you are and your sexuality, that's when it can get problematic, right?
yeah, and it produces slavery. It's a promise of freedom that in the end produces slavery. Again, it relates to the bottom up and top down, because people think bottom up, you can just choose day by day, moment by moment, how you want to live. But certain patterns will eventually emerge, and those will constrain you. So if you're not consciously choosing healthy patterns, other ones will find themselves, someone pursuing whatever kind of sexuality they want will find themselves eventually stuck. Even if they're just stuck in the pursuit of sexual pleasure, even if the expression is constantly changing, the fact that their life is now wrapped up in pursuing weird sexual experiences, they aren't as free to choose against that. If they were truly free, they could, you know, stop doing that tomorrow, but they won't, because they've created a pattern, and it's going to take a lot of uphill battle. Which
So
reminds
I
me of
had this
another.
conversation recently where there was a guy who said, like, you know, I've been trying for a long time to stop watching porn, for example, and it's just not working very well. So therefore, now his approach that he's decided for is, well, now I'm just going to accept every part of myself, also the darker sides that I judge negatively or something like that, right? That was his kind of formulation. So it becomes a question of like accepting who I am. And I kind of get why he does that, and I understand it as well, especially when, you know, like there is this kind of like top down, like, oh, you need to stop watching porn. And it's like, well, you know, I very strongly believe like that's a really bad idea to tell a guy like, oh, you need to stop watching porn, because like you're not providing him with anything else, right? So that energy doesn't have anything to flow towards. And I think any therapist worth his salt knows, like, you know, if someone's self-medicating with anything, then if you want to take that self-medication away, you have to provide them with something better. And it's actually hard to find something for a lot of young men in our society today, to find something better. It's like, well, that's almost, I don't think that I can provide that. I think, you know, that's almost like a divine gift that has to come to them, right?
Yeah, and that's again where orthodoxy is helpful. It's often painful. It's not as if you start going and working with a priest and everything just fixes itself. I mean, in the short term, psychedelics they can produce that kind of transformation. The problem is if that's your only method of transformation, what happens when you don't have access to that? Whereas orthodoxy takes longer, and it's hard work, but because it's the hard work and you did it yourself, it's like the whole thing about if you lose a bunch of weight really fast, you might put it back on really fast, but if you lose it slowly over years, it's more likely to stay off. So obviously there's that, and a lot of people aren't willing to try orthodoxies. For some emergency cases, there's always psychedelics, and I've had good experiences, but I also know of people who haven't, and I think it's kind of a wild west, spiritually
Well, the
speaking.
thing you didn't mention, but what I feel is vital is like, who is it that you're doing the psychedelics with, right? It's like, what are their values? Because what I think you do is psychedelics kind of just like opens you up to new ways of seeing things, new perspectives, right? It allows for new neural connections to be made inside the brain on a physical level, but on a kind of, perceptual level, then you just see things in a new light. And often it would be, so in these smoking experiments that you talk about, you're often with a therapist who's skilled in helping people to not be addicted to smoking anymore, right? So he can kind of provide that, like, and so a transcendental mystical experience is often just like things falling into place. When I've like been battling with an issue for a long time and not finding it, and then like it might be like I read a piece of wisdom literature or something like that, and ding, everything falls into place. And actually experience that as like, that's in some ways that's God's voice speaking to me. It's a revelation of wisdom or truth that comes from above, right? And so people who are just like, like in all kinds of different scenarios, very often unmediated, uncontrolled, unfacilitated, you're just like taking psychedelics and then expecting like, oh, now I'm going to meet God. It's like, well, you'll probably there's a chance you'll meet something if that's what you're looking for, right? But it might not be, and it might even look like an angel or God or something like that as well, but it's not always going to be the case.
Well, and on my biggest trip, I met an entity that warned me about other entities I might meet. So
did you interpret that as could you tell us a little bit about what that entity, what do you mean by an entity, and how did you meet it?
So with mushrooms specifically, it's very common for people to meet like a concentrated presence, like a singular presence. Terence McKenna talks about this. Even Sam Harris somewhat recently had a mushroom trip where he encountered, of course, he writes it off as just all in his head. But it's common to encounter on higher doses of psilocybin a presence, and I definitely had that. And there was a lot in there, but there was a point where I kind of started sensing the presence of other things, and it like warned me not to go over there. Mm-hmm. But again, that shows, even if you're as optimistic as can be, it still shows the potential of maybe next time I try it, I only encounter those other things. And this entity was very clear that it wasn't God, but maybe I meet something that tells me that it is, and I'm suggestible enough to believe it. Mm-hmm. So that's the risk.
Do you interpret this as like angels and demons?
Yeah, I think there are different ways of describing the same phenomena, but yes, I think, what other people have described that way. My view of that, my patron Saint Dionysius talks about the celestial hierarchy. There's different kinds of spiritual beings. And he even says that the way they present themselves is not how they truly are. Mm-hmm. They present themselves in certain ways to tell us something true about them, but we're not seeing them for themselves. Mm-hmm. But yes, I do think that, again, maybe from the top-down perspective, you're encountering spirits. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be bottom-up like explanations. I think that when the Native American tribe talks about the spirit of the deer, and scientist talks about the organismic perspective of that species, and when the church fathers talk about God gave an angel to watch over every kind of animal, I think they're all describing the same phenomena. Mm-hmm. From different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. And you can have a first-hand experience of that through the use of psychedelics,
and many other ways.
And many other ways.
Mm-hmm.
Such as,
prayer, meditation, the common ones, fasting. There are a lot of ways. I mean, psychedelics is kind of the most reliable, I suppose, in the sense of most mathematically probabilistic to generate a transcendent experience. Mm-hmm. But people you achieve those states without psychedelics. Joseph the Hesychast praying in a cave had all sorts of experiences. Saint Porphyrios in a cave would the rocks would tell him about previous saints who had prayed in that cave. So there's all sorts of ways.
Yeah. So when you talk about most reliably, also like, so there's, I think in all communities, people are aware of that. Like, this is kind of like a shortcut in some ways, right? And so it's like, often there's that energy or spirit of like, not doing your homework, but looking straight for like the experience or the goal. And that often that will, you know, set a path or direction in some ways, or come with consequences further down the road. I guess, yeah.
And it
Where
often doesn't provide new structure. Psychedelics are great at destroying structures, and a lot of us have structures in our mind that need to be destroyed, but they often don't provide anything new. And I think part of why I was able to integrate my experiences as well as I did is because I was already exploring orthodoxy at that point. So I had a lot of structure. Now that I've had these things cleared out, like what can I put in their place, I already had something in mind. But if you don't have that, you can either fall into the same patterns or develop new ones.
Okay. So do you see your Orthodox faith as compatible with the use of psilocybin or other psychedelics? Or do you see these things as, is that now excluded for you, or?
Well, broadly speaking, that's one of those talk to your priest things.
Priest thing.
For me, there hasn't been as much of an explicit discussion about it. I mean, I've talked to the priests I've known about it. I would put it in the category of, as far as my conscience, I don't think they're intrinsically wrong, but I know orthodoxy is generally disfavorable. So I look at it like if you were to marry a vegan, you might be signing up for veganism, even if you don't think there's anything wrong with eating meat. And my relationship with orthodoxy is more important than, I guess, my own opinions on it. So I don't consider them intrinsically evil. I think they have potential and are dangerous. And most of the people,
I mean, like, you know, if we're talking about mind-altering substances, then, you know, alcohol is a very integrated substance that is used in the Bible.
Yes.
There's negative verses, but there's also positive verses about it, right? And so obviously it's not like, you know, Jesus also drank wine and provided a lot of good wine for a wedding, even after people have been drinking for some time. So there's space for these things. I guess for me, the question is like, if you're considering psychedelics, it's like, what is your goal with it? Do you have the discernment to handle the experiences? Like, do you know for sure that you're able to handle with discernment these experiences that you're going to have? And also, again, it's the thing of like, well, you know, maybe the reason why it takes, you know, many, many hours of meditation to be able to reach a certain place is because that's developing the kind of qualities in you to be able to handle what the insights that might come. And so Carl Jung has this quote that I think I heard from Jordan Peterson, which is, you know, beware of unearned wisdom. You know, when there's some things that, you know, can be very destructive and very difficult to handle for people. You know, we often see things that we maybe would have been better off not having seen.
Be as if someone gave you the best climbing gear and the warmest clothes and just placed you near the top of Mount Everest. It says you can make it the rest of the way, rather than having cultivated the discipline that it would take to get to that point on your own. You might get to the top of the mountain with all that extra gear, but it would have been better to have really practiced and done an evaluation beforehand.
Yeah.
And then, like Wim Hof, you can climb it in shorts and sandals. Yeah,
because we're living in a culture which is so focused on results and the experience, right? And so there's that I'd say that's the constant danger. And it's actually the process of becoming the kind of man who can ascend Everest. It's that process that's the important thing. It's the journey, not just the getting to the top. And I think probably anybody who's been up Mount Everest or any other major goal like that would agree to that, right? It's like, the experience was important of being up there, but it was the process that really gave them the biggest gifts.
Yeah, and that ties into our cultural, really globalist obsession with quantity over quality. Whatever we can quantify. And
just read an article
that makes me
actually. Who was it? Someone said like that we've stepped into the religion of the quantity. But Alex, I think that was a very good discussion. I think we've gone in more corners. I didn't see the psychedelics thing coming, but that certainly does give it something for people to dig into. So thanks very much for the talk. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for hosting.
Yeah, and let's hopefully continue to have some more good comments, discussions as well on here. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.